If every political scientist on the planet died tomorrow, really only our loved ones would grieve.
I'm Eric Wilson, managing partner of Startup Caucus, the home of campaign tech innovation on the right. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, you're joining in on a conversation with entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. Our guest today is Bob Maranto. He's the 21st Century Chair in Leadership in the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. He's a founding member of the Society for Open Inquiry in the Behavioral Sciences. In our conversation today, we discuss the field of political science and the effect of polarization in academia on that field. So, Bob, I've got a confession to make before we get started. I've worked professionally in politics for more than 15 years, and that's after never taking a single political science course during my undergraduate education. So, for our listeners who are like me, give us an overview of the field of political science and what it seeks to study.
I mean, that's pretty easy. Political science it's what political scientists do, right? And that's gone through a couple incarnations. It used to be more sort of con law and Western history and Western civ. About 70 years ago, the behavioral revolution started, and we got more into trying to make it a science, trying to develop theories that you would test and apply to the real world. And the last 40 years, I'd say we've been a lot more diverse. We've been sort of all over the map. And that's been fun. I mean, I find it an incredibly fun field. It's also ideologically a little more diverse than most of academia. But that said, I have to say I've been in electoral politics. I was elected to 2 minor offices and lost at 1. I love my field. We're great. But I think if every political scientist on the planet died tomorrow, really only our loved ones would grieve, right? I mean, it's like most of the social sciences, right? It's not quite like doctors or lawyers or engineers. I think what we should be doing, until quite recently, and even to some degree now, the field's pretty pluralist. Most of us think that Florida is a better place than Cuba, right? Most of us think that the U.S. and Britain and France and Germany are better options than the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China. And I think that one place where we have failed is not having enough impact on K-12 education to explain to people why that is.
Right, the civics education.
Yeah. And honestly, a lot of at least the elite schools of education have been taken over by critical theorists. There's some evidence that's happening in political science, and critical theorists do think that Cuba is a better model than Florida. And I'm always kind of pointing out, it's like, hey, I don't see like millions of Floridians trying to escape to Cuba, right? I mean, I don't see lots of people in neighboring countries saying, man, I want to try to get into Venezuela because, that's where we want to be, right? And these are things
it's as close as empirical data as you can get.
Yeah, it really is, right? And so we should be able to say that and make that case. And so I actually worked a long time back in the Clinton administration. I mean, I didn't vote for Bill Clinton. I'm a center-right guy. But most reasonable people, Democrats, Republicans, independents, we agree on a lot of basic things, right? And increasingly, academia doesn't. Political science is kind of a holdout. We're still mostly pluralist. I want to make sure we stay that way. If we don't, I really kind of fear for the future of the country.
So I want to lay some more groundwork about political science and some of the methodologies that you get from other social sciences. Obviously, some of our listeners will be familiar with work of people like Don Green that we read about in the Victory Lab, where they're doing more field experiments. Do you incorporate that into your work, or are you on a different end of the spectrum of sort of field work?
I mean, I'm on a different end of the spectrum. I used to do a lot of quantitative, mostly survey research in large institutions, especially the federal government. Over time, I've shifted more to doing sort of historical stuff on how institutions became the way they are, and also just plain work in schools. I'm writing a book now I was a reformer on my local school board for 5 years, and I wrote a couple of books on the Bush-Clinton education policies, which I mostly liked, and never fully realized why they failed until I spent 5 years on a school board. I was like, and it's not the school where people are bad, horrible, awful people, and it's not.
You had to get out of your ivory tower.
You have to get out of the ivory tower. It's also, it's not that Presidents Bush and Obama were bad people. I thought they had a lot of good ideas, but we need to sort of do a better job understanding each other. And I think getting out of the ivory tower is really useful. I think behavioral social science, I think that experimental social science There are some insights it can bring, but I think a lot of times it's very narrow because it's based on the questions you ask in the lab. It's also based though on, what's your target? Mostly it's undergraduates taking psychology classes. And so that's not a real representative group. And a lot of times in the social sciences, we've come up with just silly findings based on who we're studying. I recall studies of romantic love finding that there was no relationship between how long people thought their relationship would last and how long it did last. The subjects were 19-year-olds in taking psychology courses at the University of Minnesota, right? I mean, no, that's a bad sample, right? So I think sometimes we place too much trust in experimental research. It needs to be part of what we do, but I don't want it to take over my field or any field.
Yeah, the lab conditions of a perfect setting where you can measure things to academic rigor that are rarely found in the real world can
actually a really funny example is a game theory example from back in the 70s. And don't ask me to say what it was, but I don't remember now. But a lot of game theory finds that states generally don't go to war. Somebody replicated this, but using guys who were in prison. They were way more risk accepted, right? So then the question is, are leaders of countries closer to 19-year-old undergrads or felons? And right. That's a really good question, right?
I have a guess there. Obviously, Bob, the field of political science has to confront partisan differences. You can't study the subject without addressing that. And you alluded to the polarization of academia, which we are seeing in stark contrast lately, particularly with the controversy around elite university presidents and their statements around the Israel-Gaza conflict. So how is that affecting your discipline, and what do you think is at stake for the professionalism of that field?
I mean, I think in my field, we are still fairly pluralist. In fact, I would say that every recent president of American Political Science Association, except for possibly the current one, has been committed to pluralism. The idea that we have free speech, we have free elections, we have a free press, we don't put each other in jail for political differences, we don't have woke mobs dictating policy, we have congressional committee hearings, we have processes and court cases and all those things. I worry that we are going to go the way of some other fields and embrace more of a Cuban model, more of an activist model, and that would be horrible in two counts. I mean, first off, we're going to lose public legitimacy, and that's already happening. Most Republicans don't trust higher education. Sometimes we deserve it, sometimes we don't. But I think sometimes Republicans act in a too almost Pavlovian way. It's like higher education bad. It's a much more mixed picture than that. But half of Democrats are starting to feel that way as well, including, I mean, why was I working in the Clinton administration? Well, I was one of the few people in the field who liked what they were doing in reinventing government. So they tagged me, right? I joke about this, but it's kind of true. When I was working for the Clinton administration, I was a little below the political level, but I was politically vetted. I was kind of right in the middle. There were people left of me, people to the right of me. In academia, I'm a crazy right winger. It's a little weird, right? It's kind of a strange thing about that. So part of it is society will lose trust in academia if we're not more ideologically diverse. But there's a second problem that's as big, which is that we don't really understand the right very well because we don't have enough conservatives and moderates in academia. Political science was way better on that than most other fields, but we still have a bit of a problem. Musa El-Gharbi, who's a progressive, I mean, a great guy, great political scientist. So he's quite progressive. I've been friends with him for 5 or 6 years now. Has written some wonderful things. I think the best one is Race and the Race for the 2020 presidential presidency. Social scientists have been getting the Trump phenomena in particular wrong, because we come at it with the idea that, these must be a bunch of crazy racist yahoos. And well, I'm personally not a Trump supporter. Trump's done unusually well among Hispanic voters for a Republican candidate, among Black voters, among other groups that Republicans don't usually do very well among. He has done worse among college-educated whites than any Republican probably since the 60s. So to label this a white supremacist movement is very misleading, to not understand, some legitimate grievances.
Not just misleading, but doesn't align with the empirical data.
Yeah,
right?
we want a lot of academics. We want to think, right, that anybody who votes for Trump is a racist, ignorant so and so, and that's not true. And at the same time, most people who are voting for Joe Biden are not anti-American.
Right.
And so I think in most of the public, I think most Republicans out there in the electorate know that. I think in academia, because we are so sheltered and increasingly so ideologically homogenous, some fields more than others, we're misunderstanding the society around us, and that's a huge problem. Another problem is class. I'm the first gen high school graduate on my mom's side, first gen college attending on my dad's side, and I spent a lot of years working in a factory. There are very few social scientists now with that kind of background,
Right.
and that really limits how we can understand that the people who pay our salaries ultimately.
Yeah, I found this in my own experience as a fellow at a university, which sought to bring in practitioners, and I really did feel like I was the token conservative in the program, and speaking at a panel to undergraduates and discussing the need for voter ID, which is a common function around the world. But
Yes.
it was sort of like, how dare you come and
Right.
espouse these views? So
Well,
what are
let me stop you there for a second. Okay, so I always find this kind of funny. A friend of mine who studies Georgia politics, and he said I can't use his name because he could get in trouble, which in itself is weird, right? This is an academic one. You can't use his name. So he says, look at it. Stacey Abrams, who narrowly lost for governor of Georgia, spent 4 years contesting it and saying it was voter fraud, it was this, it was that. And he put out, she had the same record in court as Donald Trump, who lost by a narrower margin. I mean, Georgia elections are by and large pretty clean. They're pretty well run. They're mostly run on the county level. So if there's problems with long lines in Democratic run counties, it ain't Republicans' fault, right? These are basic things the news media never pointed out, right? Never. I mean, the media was all attacking Georgia elections until Trump started attacking them. And they're like, oh, no, Georgia elections are amazing. Georgia elections are actually pretty well run. But, I've been involved in a lot of elections. If we don't have voter ID, there's going to be some fraud, right? And that's not because people are bad people. It's because they're people. Britain tried to do away with voter ID for a while. They brought it back because you need an ID, right? I mean, there's just common sense. The vast majority of Democrats and Republicans agree on that, actually. But if you bring it up in an academic setting, if you bring it up in the news media, you're a racist.
Right.
And this closes off a lot of really useful discussions that we should be having. And, I'm sorry to filibuster here, but this is kind of an obsession of mine. So I was raised in Baltimore, real high crime city back in the 70s when I was there, still is. And so the Black Lives Matter movement gets going, and I worked in a mostly Black setting for years. My dad did for about 40 years, and I was like, yeah, there are some real issues there. The police aren't always as good as they should be. There are some issues with police brutality. There's even more serious issues with law enforcement. I mean, the bottom line is, if you're in Baltimore, if you're white, the cops are probably going to protect you. If you're Black, it's a lot more dicey. So me and a couple of colleagues did something we thought was really cool. We ranked the first 25, now 50 largest police departments in the country, controlling for poverty, on two simple things. One is, do the police kill civilians? We have measures of that.
Right.
One is, what's the homicide rate, which takes, multiple times more life than the police do. And when I talk to regular people in a coffee shop, like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Why don't people do that? But yeah, we've done this. We know which police departments are doing a great job. We think we know why. Other places should copy them. When I tell regular people this, like, oh, that's really amazing research. When I present this in academic panels, they're like, well, why would anyone study that? I mean, Black Lives Matter. I mean, that's to increase progressive voter turnout. I'm like, okay, that's great. But you know what? I mean, I grew up in an integrated setting. My family's had Black folks in it for 40 years now. What if we actually wanted to hypothetically save Black lives, right? Then maybe we might do research on which police departments are more and less effective and copy the better ones. Academia misses a lot of stuff. And that's really tragic, because we should play a role in helping society. And by the way, you can probably guess what's the best police department in the country, has been for years by far.
Is it the New York Police Department?
Yes, NYPD. And 30 years ago they were horrible, right? They
Right.
changed, they got better. We can all do that. NYPD is excellent. They slipped back a little bit under Mayor De Blasio. The current mayor, Eric Adams, is improving them. If he has 2 terms, I think he'll get us back to where we were before De Blasio. Which one's the worst? You can probably guess. And when I talk to experts in the field, they all know. Nobody's calculated the numbers. They all know. Baltimore, when you control for poverty, because, high poverty town, it's harder to police, right? Baltimore was worse when we did our ranking 6 years back. It remains worse. It probably ain't going to get better because the Maryland political system doesn't work very well. And because nobody's talking about this, right? Because nobody's talking about things that would actually save Black lives. But anyway, it's a huge problem. If we don't have a wide range of voices asking a wide range of questions, there's always the danger we're going to be taken over by activists who shout the loudest, and who control the DEI bureaucracies and can get you fired just by calling you a racist. And we are increasingly moving in that direction. And as we move in that direction, people are going to want to defund us, right? It's pretty predictable. It's not rocket science.
Right. So can I ask how much, so obviously there's sort of the activism that's going on, but how much of this is that there just aren't many conservative voices in academia? People don't feel comfortable speaking out. So it could be the case that you go on to a faculty or go to many of your colleagues who don't have exposure to right of center colleagues or have relationships with Republicans or may have grown up in a context where they would have been exposed to, traditionally conservative values.
I mean, the thing that I always say is that people constantly talk about inclusion. And I'm like, inclusion means all kinds of voices, right? And including voices that you might not completely be comfortable with. Right. The best work in academia now, I think, for making academia more ideologically diverse and more open to different voices is being done by people on the center left. My friend Jonathan Zimmerman at University of Pennsylvania, actually, Jonathan Haidt at NYU is doing amazing work. He founded Heterodox Academy. My own group, the Society for Open Inquiry in the Behavioral Sciences, were maybe a little more extreme than Heterodox, but Heterodox is great. They're doing very good work, and they're doing it just because they're intellectually curious people, and they're willing to listen to voices on the right. Sometimes they change their own views as a result, but they also realize that now that Republicans have been purged from a number of fields, centrist Democrats are next. Right.
Right.
So, I mean, like I said, I was working for the Bill Clinton administration, and I was happy to do so. And I agreed with most of the people on most of the things. People like that are being purged from higher ed, at least the elite parts of higher ed and from certain fields. That makes higher education not a very fun place to be, whether you're on the center right or even the left, knowing that your colleagues around you might report a tip to the bias and response team, and suddenly you'll have to go through a 6-month investigation, right?
A struggle session.
Yeah, a struggle session, and forced to apologize for your whiteness, etc. Nobody wants to live in that environment, right? Yeah. It's empowering people who are mini Stalins. And by the way, very few people of color want to be in that environment. Very few gays and lesbians want to be in that environment. And a lot of the leaders of the movement to make academia more diverse are people of color. And I hate to say this, if you look at Harvard University, a lot of the people the current president is or in the process of purging are people of color. Roland Fryer, that broke the news, but there are a number of others. We really have to fight against this, or higher education will be lost, with it K-12 education, and ultimately with it America. We need to have voices grounded in reality, and we need to have a diverse set of voices.
You're listening to the Business of Politics show. I'm speaking with Bob Maranto from the University of Arkansas about the field of political science. Bob, I want to shift gears now to how more practitioners, as academics would call them, the campaigners in the trenches, how can we benefit from political science research, and what tips would you give to a layman like me or one of our listeners for reading and understanding academic studies? Because we know that so obviously I come from the right. Our colleagues on the left are working very closely with academics to do experiments and testing and things like that. The work always gets published. We don't get access to it as early as they do, but we do want to encounter it and make sure we're updating our strategies accordingly. So how should we do that?
I mean, that's a great question. I used to do campaign stuff like 30 years ago. I haven't since. So in a lot of ways, I'm the wrong person to ask. I would say a couple of things. I mean, first, don't mythologize it. I mean, we political scientists do not have an amazing track record predicting elections. We're pretty good at predicting the past. We have enormous trouble predicting the future. So don't mythologize what we do. And one of our problems is we don't have diverse voices around us. I was quite sure Trump was going to lose in 2016, and one of my grad students, I will not name this individual because they could get in trouble if I did, who, we were friends and I knew he was going to vote. I knew this individual was going to vote for Trump. And they were telling me a week before the election how it was going to go. And I said, that's actually a plausible model. You're right. Trump actually has a better chance than I thought. And of course, on election night, this individual turned out to be correct. I think so. A key thing is surround yourself with people. And James Carville says this a lot. Don't hang out in the faculty lounge. Surround yourself with different kinds of people and be willing to listen to their insights. I think the best political science work I've seen on campaigns, on anything, has been done by people with real world experiences. The best book I've ever seen on campaigns, although I've been out of this for a while, campaigns and voting decisions, is The Reasoning Voter by Samuel Popkin at University of California, San Diego. Popkin worked in at least 5 different Democratic presidential campaigns. I know he was a big advisor to Gary Hart back in the 80s, worked for the Clinton White House a little bit. And he mixes this very sophisticated knowledge of studies of voting behavior with just practical, he's been there. He's been there in campaigns. And so for me, the best work in these areas is usually done by people with one foot in each world. A problem political scientists have is, in voting behavior, there are very few open Republicans. Same thing in psychology. I think Stanley Tetlock at University of Pennsylvania is wonderful. And he's got a little crew of people around him. Corey Clark is one. There's a few others. So I'm going to identify people who have feet in multiple worlds. But also be aware we're always a little behind the times. So one reason why our polling isn't as good as it should be is polls, they don't work the way they do 20 years back. The more sophisticated polling agencies have figured it out. A lot of us haven't. And so we are in the blind more than we used to be. I think there's a third thing that neither party really gets, which is that we're living in an age of alienation. My grandparents were Sicilian, and in Sicily, nobody trusted the government, right? And everybody at least pretended to like the mafia because it was the safer way to go. The same in most Latin American countries, the same thing in China, the same in any communist country. We're moving in that direction. We've got a lot of voters. African Americans actually traditionally were this way for understandable reasons. But increasingly, this is working class whites and even middle and upper class whites as well that are like, well, I don't really trust anyone. So if I say the wrong thing, I might get fired. So if a pollster asks me a question, I might lie about it. Or if my neighbor asks me a question, I might lie about it. And I think that puts us in a whole different world, in a very negative world for political campaigns, because it means that appeals to the negative are much more likely to work than appeals to the positive. But it also means that we just don't know what's out there, right? We don't know what people are thinking. On universities, honestly, most people, there's all these young people chanting pro-Hamas slogans. I would bet that not 1 in 100 has read the Hamas Charter, which calls for the slaughter of Jews. A UC Berkeley political scientist just did the study. I can't remember his name, but it was just published last week in a popular outlet. He surveyed over 100 students and said, well, what does from the river to the sea mean? They couldn't identify the river. They couldn't identify the sea. And most of them thought it meant a 2-state solution in the Middle East, which is not what Hamas wants.
The exact
right? That's
opposite.
not it, right? Yeah, they want it the way Hitler did. right? They want to kill all the Jews and take over, right? I mean, and they're very open about this, right? It's not like they're hiding it. Hitler was at least hiding the camps, right? So we have this massive distrust along with massive ignorance. And it puts us in this world where it's harder to run elections. It's impossible to run honest elections. And then when you get elected, you know that your message, most people aren't going to get it. They're going to interpret it through their pre-existing prisms, whether on the left or the right, which are going to tend to be conspiracy minded. We're all Sicilians now, right? That's not good. I mean, that's not why my grandparents, snuck into this country a century back, right? I mean, they didn't want.
What do you mean we can't run honest campaigns?
If you run an honest campaign and come out and say, Joe Biden, hey, I kind of like what he did in supporting Israel. I kind of like this other thing he did on education. He's a total cluster, right? He's
right.
been the worst president ever, maybe in my area. The economy, the massive deficits and just giving handouts, ultimately not the way to go. Racial and ethnic quotas. A, Americans don't want them. B, they never work, right? You can't run an honest nuance campaign saying, hey, Joe Biden's okay on this. He's not so okay on that. Donald Trump, there are a lot of terribly unsuitable things about Donald Trump. I mean, a lot of what people say about him actually is true. If you're running a Republican primary, you really can't say that unless you want to finish ninth, right? So you have to kind of sugarcoat it. And everybody behind the scenes knows this about Trump, right? I mean, everybody behind the scenes will tell you some things about Biden and Harris that are not very flattering. But because the electorate is so polarized, you can't be as honest as you could have been 30 or 40 years back, I think.
Yeah.
And that makes it way harder.
I wonder, though, if that's more an artifact of our media and platform fragmentation. This is something that I've studied my own research, looking at how voters get their information, and your ability to drive a nuanced message has essentially gone away because there's no shared.
Wait! Isn't that why Mitt Romney's president now? No.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so there's no shared. People aren't watching the same 3 TV channels for their news. They're not reading the same newspaper. They're not going to the same churches or houses of worship. And honestly, the elites brought this on themselves, right? So, like I said, I studied Black Lives Matter some. My research assistant and I looked at New York Times coverage in the 4 weeks after George Floyd was killed. In not a single article of the 300 we were able to find did they mention that police killings of civilians are extremely rare, and from the limited data seem far rarer than they were 50 years back. No one knows that. When I talk to undergrads, they say, "Oh yeah, police are killing. They're killing 50,000 people a year, right?" No, they're killing about 1,000 people a year. About 1 in 700 cops in a given year kills someone, and the vast majority of the time is justified. Not every time, the vast majority of the time it is. The media has never reported that. Even the right-wing media hasn't reported that. So why should I trust the media, right? The New York Times just last week reported an alleged case of censorship at my university, and they got it completely and totally wrong. And while they were developing the story, people on campus sent them emails saying, no, you're missing this part of the story. They never reported it. Why on earth should I trust the New York Times? I mean, I shouldn't and I don't, right? I mean, that's a sad world, right? It's just sad. So I putting a more optimistic spin on that, how can we build better relationships between, let's say, practitioners like me and academics like you to make sure that we're sort of creating we're learning from your colleagues, but also your colleagues are getting a more realistic perspective on how this actually works. So for just to underline the example, it probably would have been helpful for conservatives to underline that stat about police killings, but because we don't have much contact with academia, we can't access that.
That's true. I think build relationships where you can. And there are a lot of places in academia that can and will help you out. And honestly, at most universities, it's even reasonably safe to do so. I mean, most universities aren't Harvard. They finished dead last in the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression's free speech rankings, the worst ever, actually. I can tell you some funny stories about Harvard. I think they probably deserve it, sadly. But most universities aren't Harvard. Most universities have more diversity. Political science remains a somewhat diverse field. Business schools remain somewhat academically diverse. Cultivate relationships with people at universities you can cultivate relationships with. There are actually more of them than you think. The Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason, Nigel Ashford, who runs that, they're a great clearinghouse for this stuff. So is the American Enterprise Institute. They do wonderful work in this area. So find out who in your state you can work with, you can cultivate. And in most states there is someone or a few people. And some of us are on the down low, but a lot of us aren't. Academia is not yet as bad as Rush Limbaugh always said we were. We're moving in that direction, but we're not there yet. So I would say cultivate those relationships. I would also just reach out. You do campaigning things, and you said you've already done this. Call your local state university or private university, and state universities will usually be a little better about this actually. And just, call the political science department and say, hey, I'm a campaign practitioner. I'm a Republican. If you ever want to do a debate, I'd be glad to take part. If you ever want to have me as a guest speaker, I'd be glad to do that. If you need someone to teach an adjunct class, I'd be glad to do that. If you need someone to advise the college Republicans, and I'd be able to do that, I'd be willing to help out. Most political scientists actually remain pluralists. The field's around 12 to 1 now, left to right, which for academia, that's actually pretty good. But the majority of the left of center people in the field are pluralists. They don't want to purge Republicans. They want to. I've actually been invited to a few things. It's like, hey, Bob, you're a little right of center. Why don't you come and be on this panel? People in my field remain relatively open. I'm fighting to keep it that way. So the political science department is often a good place to have that conversation, to say, hey, can I work with you folks to help mold the next generation of young people? Because it doesn't help if Democrats and Republicans hate each other and misunderstand each other. That's really not good for any of us. I mean, that just empowers the extremes on both sides. That's really not good for America. And so I would try to reach out in those ways. And honestly, Democratic policymakers are generally not hard left. So, I mean, I will fairly often have Democratic policymakers. I work with some, reach out to me because I'll write something that is centrist or center right, and they'll reach out and say, okay, why did you write this? What do you think this? And, neither Democratic nor Republican policymakers are nearly as extreme as the media makes them out to be. And so I think you could take advantage of that to build relationships. James Carville used to say this. He said, Republicans are really my enemy one day a year, right? The rest of the time, not so much, right?
Yeah, I do find that, a lot with my colleagues in the campaign technology and digital marketing space. We face the same challenges. We square off from time to time. But really, if your goal is to get closer to the truth, you need to update with information, no matter where it comes from. So, Bob, before we wrap up, I want to give you a little bit of a challenge. So let's say you became the campaign manager for a presidential candidate. How would you as a political scientist run it differently? What would you test out or experiment with? And my gosh, I'm blanking on who wrote it, but there's the 65% Project, I think it's called. A social scientist and his undergraduate. He won an award from the, I can't remember if it was from Heterodox Academy or I think it was from Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression for FIRE, because somebody at his university actually tried to cancel him for this. He did a study. He said, all right, let's just poll a bunch of items and see what polls above 65%, where, maybe majorities in both parties agree, or maybe an overwhelming majority in one party and like half of the other party agree. And one is we don't want to use racial quotas, right? One is we really don't want to defund the police, right? And he said, let's try to build a platform around those things. And again, somebody at the university tried to cancel him for this. For me, it's pretty obvious, right? And a winning
political campaign, you're getting from wherever you start, 20%, wherever it is, to 51%, 52%, and ideally higher. And I would take those things that 65% or more of Americans agree on, that maybe at least parts of the opposing party disagrees on, and I would try to paint them into a corner on that. And I would make that my platform. And I'd also say people are actually getting tired of fighting. People are getting tired of being canceled. The book I'm editing, one thing we point out is that 48% of Americans now say they self-censor at work.
Wow.
That is more than 3 times the percentage during the McCarthy era. The McCarthy era, I would say, was not the best part of American history, right? Let's not be worse than Joe McCarthy, right? So, I mean, this is a huge problem. If you can just run saying the person that I want to remove fear from your work life. I want to remove fear from your political life. I want to remove fear from higher education. I don't want us to be Harvard University. I want us to be America again. And here's how I plan to do it. I'm going to work with Democrats. I'm going to work with Republicans, and I'm going to work with independents, and I'm going to work with whoever, because this is an amazing country and I love it. Somebody who can express that vision clearly. Marco Rubio, I felt really could. Nikki Haley seems to be the person now who's really good at expressing that positive message. I think if I'm that person, there's enormous potential there. And, we don't teach history now. When we do teach it, we teach it horrendously, right? America was not founded to protect slavery. Everyone who studied the founding fathers in 1776 and the Constitutional Convention agrees on this. There's actually a wonderful Politico story. The headline said it all. I was the fact checker for the New York Times 1619 project. The Times ignored me, right? Google it. It's a great article by a serious historian. If you can just be that reasonable person, you could win pretty easily. And to take a historical illusion, there was enormous battling in the first decade of the 1800s. And there was serious talk of going to war. Vice President Aaron Burr,
right.
He would have led a succession movement if he could have, right? There were duels, et cetera. And then James Monroe came in and set up what was later called the era of good feeling, right? And I think Americans are ready for an era of good feeling. And whoever campaigns on that, I think, has a very good chance of winning. And there's going to be a lot of people. I'm thinking of Jonathan Haidt at NYU. I'm thinking of my buddy John Zimmerman at University of Pennsylvania, that they may be liberal Democrats. But if the right Republican put out that call, maybe they probably wouldn't vote for you, right? But after you won, they would work with you. And they would, at least in this area, be very supportive. And I think that's more how we need to look at politics today, how to make it additive and not subtractive. I mean, my goodness, who wins when we fight each other? Russia wins. Communist China wins. Cuba wins. Venezuela wins. Do we really want that? I certainly don't. And there's a lot of great stories I can have along those lines. And something positive I'll say, the Trump administration started this, especially Betsy DeVos. And to its credit, after a late start, the Biden administration is starting to sign on. American universities are getting tens of billions of dollars from countries that are dictatorships, from China, from Iran, indirectly through Qatar, from countries like that. This is having an impact on what's going on in American universities. I know others can see this. This is a serious problem, and it's a problem that Democrats and Republicans, and honestly, at this point, most university professors even, this is something we should be talking about, and this is something that we need to address, not in a nasty or punitive way, certainly not attacking international students, many who are my friends, certainly not attacking immigrants. But it's a real problem when a Chinese American is afraid to listen to a Chinese dissident at an American university because they know that there are people in the audience who will take pictures of them, and their grandmother back in Shanghai could get in trouble. That's a serious problem. And we as Americans need to face this and related problems and come together on those issues.
Well, I want to thank Professor Bob Maranto for a great conversation today. I'll include links to his website where you can find his works and some recent articles he's written in our show notes. I know I've got a reading list here that I've been writing down, so thank you for the homework, Professor. If this episode made you a little bit smarter as a listener or gave you something to think about, all we ask is that you share it with a friend or colleague You'll look smarter in the process. More people find out about the show. It's a win-win all around. So remember to subscribe to the Business of Politics show wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can also sign up for email updates and look at past episodes on our website at businessofpoliticspodcast.com. With that, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. The Business of Politics show is produced by Advocacy Content Kitchen, a media production studio.